Today is a very miserable day, to say the least. And I thought, because of the weather, I thought it might be apt to talk about what I like to call Dirtier and Grittier, also known as Grimdark. That is a subtle reference to Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fantasy. And just talking about horror, well, not so much horror, but dark fantasy, but really dark fantasy. Think Tolkien, but darker and grittier, I said. And there are numerous examples. I guess the most famous one is Game of Thrones, both the TV show and the book series. And it's just a darker version of fantasy, of what Tolkien himself set out. And dark fantasy is characterized by an emphasis on darkness, on murder, on sexual assault. Main characters get killed all the time. Everything is a crapsack world. Everything is terrible. People die constantly. And this traffic isn't gonna stop. Sorry, dude. And it's just a really horrible place to live. It is like so dark. But the works I want to talk about is things that are so dark, not just little hints of darkness, but very dark. Man, it's 10 minutes to 5 p.m. And please let me just do this chance. You can. He's not beeping at me yet, but he will soon. Crapsack world's not a very pretty place to live in. And so lots of violence, lots of death, lots of murder. Main characters die all the time. And also I've been drawing a lot of these dark fantasy themes and also reading a few things. The Warhammer Wiki, I've read some Joe Abercrombie books, and it's dark, and I'm only like 30 pages in. I'm reading Red Country by Joe Abercrombie, and it is dark. People getting hanged, people getting buried, lots of blood, lots of violence, and usually the masculine part of me says, yay, blood, violence, action, adventure. And because I used to grow up, I was a goth and an emo, and I didn't like sugary coated stuff like My Little Pony. And as it turns out, there is a darker and edgier version of My Little Pony called Fallout Edgier. That's one of them. So I was into like, not horror movies, but horror elements like vampires and werewolves, you know, the darkness of life. That's what I was into at the time. So naturally I was drawn to dark fantasy. And there is something called darkness-induced audience apathy, which means that, thank you sir, that the more dark a work is, the more the audience will become apathetic. Because the world, take Game of Thrones for example, the world of Game of Thrones is so shitty, so terrible. Lots of things, terrible things happen that you just don't care if people work out. Same with Warhammer 40,000. The setting is so depressing, so horrible. It may be easier just to have, you know, the Tyranids, the XPs of the aliens, the xenomorphs, just to wipe everything out and start all over from scratch. It's hard to relate to a character in a story, well, any of the characters in a story, if everyone's just as horrible. If it's a black and grey morality world, and everybody's black, and everybody's a villain, then there's not really much to root for, you know? Might as well kill off all the characters and save everyone's misery. So, and I played with the theme of black and grey morality in my works, most noticeably Big Bad Wolves, and coming up soon, the Purge Blades. But I try to have some goodness to my characters, because once again, if I make all my characters evil and shitty and horrible to each other, then the audience can't feel sympathetic to those characters, can't root for the good guys if the good guys are just as evil as the bad guys, you know? So there's always got to be, you can have some flaws, of course you have some flaws, just like Sopranos taught us, that you can have protagonists with some flaws. But if you go too much in one direction, then Zayn leaves the group. No. Then you're gonna have the audience is gonna have a hard time relating to someone. Yes, relating. You know? So in my characters, even though everybody's monstrous and horrible, there's one good thing about them. Take Big Bad Wolves, for example. In Big Bad Wolves, the heroes, quote unquote, are cannibals. Cannibalistic werewolves, right? But they don't murder anyone. They're monsters, but they're also not monsters in a way. And that was the theme of the show. That was rule number one, right? To those who have watched the series. Rule number one, do not murder. And my door is open for some strange reason. So I try to put some good into it. And yeah, sometimes things get so depressing, there's not a good character inside, everyone's a jerk, everyone's horrible and murderers and rapists and all sorts of nasty things. You can't relate to it. But the thing about Darkier and Edgier works, these Grimdark works, is two interesting things. Black humor. You've got to add some humor, otherwise it's going to be depressing. You don't have to make the characters likable. It can be, black humor, like someone getting choked to death by a banana. This is a reference to my first film I ever made, The Pussycat, which one of the characters get choked out with a banana. Not sure whether I should release it on YouTube, although I could. So anyway, you've got to have black humor. Warhammer has it with the orcs. You've got to have some funniness, you've got to have some lightness, otherwise, audience going to get apathetic. Same with shows like Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where it's a comedy. It's a pretty dark comedy, it's a pretty crapsack world, everybody's a jerk, everybody's horrible. But it's a comedy, there's always comedy, it always makes you laugh. So, black comedy, very useful for grim darkness. And also because everything's turned up to 11, the world is so shitty, the dark fantasy is so dark, is that it is almost laughable. You can't take it so seriously because the world isn't like that. The world isn't like that. Because if the modern world was so dark, and it seems like the world is dark, believe me, it may seem like the world is horrible and dark and all sorts of things like that. But if it was like that all the time, then it would be just anarchy, wouldn't it? People would be just killing each other in the streets. Just, hapless murder. It kind of be like that film, The Purge, but a lot more realistic than that film. So it's turned up to 11, and it's not real. It's not going to happen. Things aren't really that terrible, and sometimes, myself included, I believe I can fall into bits of mild depression where I think that the world is horrible and can't be saved. Yes, a cynical and nihilistic point of view, I know, but sometimes it's like that. The other interesting aspect of Darkier and Edgier works is that if you make it too dark, it can be quite silly. You may think something is, say if you create a film or a painting or a piece of prose, literature, if you make it too dark, then it can turn into numb. It can be silliness, you know. I'm not sure how to describe it, but if you have a feeling of what I mean, you know, like you may think when you're writing like a grim, dark story that things are so depressing, and you're making like a statement of the world that humans are bastards or other such tropes, but it turns into silliness because it's too much, and you may think it's edgy and dark to have someone get tortured, cold-blooded torture, but it turns silly because the methods they're using or something, you know, something else makes it silly. So there's that aspect too. And so to conclude, I think dark fantasy, Darkier and Edgier works, dark sci-fi has its place in literature. But if there's too much of it, too much darkness in that work, it's going to turn silly, and you've got to have some light and fluffy moments. And as an audience member of someone who likes to devour that kind of stuff, those kind of works, it can be a little tough at times, a little too much, and you start thinking that darkness-induced apathy. You start thinking that the world is truly horrible and it can't be saved, and you start getting depressed because everything's too dark. So my advice is, I do enjoy those types of works, but sometimes you need something light and fluffy, otherwise you're just going to feel down all the time, you know? So those are my thoughts.